Peter was the leader of the early disciple movement. We have to understand that. It wasn't James and John. They were there and they were leading, but Peter was the leader. You don't even know some of the names like Thaddeus, James the Lesser, Judas not Iscariot, right? These are names we barely, Nathaniel, Philip. We know the names, but we don't know them because it was Peter always at the front, right? And then, so who denies Christ? It's not Nathaniel, it's not Philip, it's not James the Less, it's not Judas, not Iscariot, it is Peter. Why does Peter do it? Have you ever thought of it? Why did Peter, of all people, deny Christ? That is a tough one. Can I bring it forward 1975 years later? Why did Bob Coy have a moral failure? A moral failure. Bob Coy is the #1 from an earthly side Christian of South Florida. More people have come to Christ in South Florida by this gentleman than any human in South Florida. Why couldn't it have been someone we've never heard of? Have you thought of that? It is not easy. Many of you came to Christ because of Bob Coy. Many of you grew in Christ because of the ministry of Bob Coy. Many of you, and you can just add all the things, over the last 30 years, he is the one who, if we had a hierarchy of religious leaders in South Florida, which we don't, but if we did, he would be at the top. And he had a moral failure. And Peter had a moral failure. You got to look. There is a connection here. And I would like to read something because I've been studying this and praying through this and working with some of the leaders down there who are friends of mine. And we've been, even this morning, we all prayed for each other before we got here. About 10 pastors from 10 different churches in South Florida. Some who are from Calvary, some from other churches. I mean, this is no simple thing that has occurred. One thing, though, before I read it, it does show us one thing, that there are none righteous, no, not one. Amen. So before you point the finger at Brother Bob, realize that all of us in this room are moral failures at some point or another. The tragic thing is that he just happened to be at the top of the heap. And it's a tragedy. Can I read something? This was written over 20 years ago. I've changed a couple of words to apply to today because I couldn't write anything. I see all these blogs people are writing and pastor. I'm thinking, man, I just can't do it. So let me just read something. Because Peter respects Jesus deeply, he refuses to let him wash his feet. Then when he learns that this is a prerequisite for discipleship, Peter asks for a full bath. In the upper room, when the disciples hear clearly Jesus' prediction of his coming death, it is Peter who is heroic, refusing to believe he will ever renounce his Lord. In the garden, he impulsively tries to defend his master with a sword. When Jesus is led away as a prisoner, Peter follows, refusing to let Jesus undergo this abuse by himself. But this great profile is overshadowed by his great failing at the high priest's house. Despite Peter's prominence, despite his role as the custodian of the faith and leader among the disciples, he can still deny him and commit a moral failure. This is a warning. Denial, faithlessness, and moral failures are always within reach for even the strongest disciple. We can understand Peter's hesitation as he stands by the fire feeling threatened by Malchus's relative in a circle of soldiers. But does he have to deny his faith the moment a young woman at the gate catches his sleeve and asks him? We dare not miss the pitifulness of this scene. But perhaps what stands out in the Gospel of John's story is Jesus' continued interest in Peter. We see this again in chapter 21. We'll talk about this in 2 weeks, but we can anticipate it even here. John reports that Jesus renews his relationship with Peter later when he meets him in Galilee. read John 21 after we leave here today. He is still a man deeply loved and deeply forgiven, a man with work to do for his master. It was the real Peter who protested his loyalty in the upper room. It was the real Peter who drew his lonely sword in the moonlight of the garden. It was the real Peter who followed Jesus because he could not leave his Lord alone. And it was the real Peter who cracked beneath the tension and denied his Lord. Here's my prayer for Bob and for all of us. The forgiving love of Jesus is so great that he sees our real selves, not in our faithfulness, but in our faith, not in our defeat by sin, but in our reaching after him, even when we are defeated. And I pray this for Bob, and I pray it for each of us. And right now, what I'd like to do is just pause and have us all pray. If you've never heard of Bob Coy, that's fine, but just know that one of God's best, like Peter, fell. But each of us, in one way or another, have fallen short, have we not? Maybe it's a time for us just to pause and to pray. So I just want to take a moment here and do that. Just take a moment quietly and pray.